Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the songs that have been stuck in my head for almost 2 decades from the album Trainwreck by Boys Night Out. It's all about the song in my head. So, for those of you who are unfamiliar with what a concept album is, the best way I can describe it to you is storytelling through musical lyrics and instrumentation. Concept albums can be considered an arrangement of songs generally themed around an idea or story that, when placed together, can theoretically convey the theme or story being told. For me, what sets concept albums apart from like movies, musicals, and books is that not only does the artist have to be able to convey the story lyrically, they also have to set a soundstage with the music and the direction they take with that music. Because that soundstage will let listeners, like cue listeners into tone, to character identifications, and not only have to spur the listener's imagination to create the settings without being able to give all the details to describe them. The music itself is akin to stage directions in a play, the emotions seen and captured on an actor's face, or the description of an environment you find in books. So I really haven't seen anybody else break down this album or like talk about it, so please feel free to enjoy my goblin rantings about it because, until proven otherwise, I'm going to consider myself kind of an unofficial expert on it. Unofficial in the sense that, like, the people who actually created it are going to be the official experts in it, and they could come out and say everything that I'm saying is wrong, completely off base. But you know what? I might also just be someone who's just insanely obsessed with like random things that may or may not mean anything. Kind of like your English teacher in high school who, when reading a book, is just like, the blue curtains in this room symbolize the sadness of this character blocking out the sun. And then later to come find out the author was just like, I had blue curtains and I really liked them, and so I just put them in the story so they don't really mean anything. I will probably have some of these moments when talking about the album because I'm very passionate about it. So I'm going to try to annotate them correctly or accordingly and call them blue curtain moments, basically just not confirmed canonical connections or conclusions that I personally have that may or may not be what is in the story actually being told. So with that in mind, let's dive into my analysis and opinions of Boys Night Out's Trainwreck. But before we can get started with any of that, you can call me Astro. I have no educations, degrees, certifications, really anything. I'm just a dude who goblin rants on the internet. And thank you for being here. Not only am I thankful for my 100 subscribers that I have, I am thankful for the people who are here who want to learn about one of my favorite albums that is not really talked about and criminally underrated. The album was conceived by Jeff Davis with the help of fellow bandmate and lyricist Connor Lavatt Frazier, forgive me if I'm not pronouncing things correctly, to take a short story Davis had written and tell it musically. And as a side note, I want to also comment that this album has been converted into a small theater stage show too, which I also think is pretty cool. They took the basic story, separated it into 12 chapters, and then compressed it into bullet point format with what would happen in each song, and then wrote the lyrics. While this album tells a contained story of its own, there is this like meta commentary symbolism embedded into it by the band that really conveys the frustration of hearing music in your head or seeing art or all of these things as someone who is creative, having a picture in your head and then being able to actually convey it, to demonstrate it, to play it in the right way so that the people that you are playing for, demonstrating for, or giving it to can truly understand the vision you have. I'm going to start by giving the overall story and then dive into each song. And the reason why I'm doing it this way is because I've rewritten the script like 4 freaking times, and this is the most coherent, non-rambly, and thorough way that I can convey all of this to you, and that it also makes sense to do it this way because the first track of the album basically just gives you the outline of the entire story anyway and just spills the spaghetti out of its pockets about what the story's about. The whole story follows the journey of the patient, our main character, who has been plagued with terrible night terrors, which are actually quite different from nightmares. And just a side note for clarification, nightmares generally occur during REM sleep cycles, are somewhat memorable, and almost always end with someone like jolting awake. Night terrors are something completely different. Everyone at some point is going to experience a nightmare in their life. Night terrors, however, are rare, and even rarer, particularly in adults. And although consistent nightmares and night terrors fall under a sleep disorder called parasomnia, which consists of abnormal behaviors, perceptions, and emotions during sleep or waking up, night terrors generally happen during non-REM sleep cycles and can cause a person to have aspects of physical or verbal reactions to what they're experiencing in their sleep, a difficulty of being awoken, and they often do not remember anything that occurred during these episodes. Generally speaking, it is very, very distressing to both the person experiencing it and anyone who happens to be witnessing it. So, with that clarified, it's during one of these episodes that the patient, unaware of his actions in his sleep, violently murders his wife, only to wake up to the tragedy before him. After seeing this act of violence, the patient becomes catatonic for an undisclosed amount of time after the trial and hospitalization. He then almost awakens from all of this in the hospital, is released, and proceeds to cut his hands off, descends more into madness and addiction and delusion. And it's in the midst of all of this descent, he murders other people in order to recreate the song that he eventually began hearing after that night. One that he believes helps him reconnect to his dead wife and alleviate this guilt or pain or emptiness within him. The story is bookended with commentary from the doctor, our other main character in this story, who, although well-intentioned, allowed the patient to slip through the cracks of care and supervision due to the patient's deceptive practices. These monologues by the doctor are wrought with hope, apprehension, and then sheer horror at the discovery of what the patient has done at the end of the album. Now that's out there, like there it is, that's it. Let's truly begin to explore Boys Night Out's Trainwreck. Introducing is the first song on the album, and we are immediately introduced to the doctor using a literary device that I have not thought of since high school called in medias res, which means in the middle or into the middle of a plot or story. We are thrown into the middle of the story via a monologue of the doctor recording and listening to his previous notes, interactions of himself and the patient. The first tape takes place in the middle of the story after the patient has mangled themselves by removing his own hands. We hear how the doctor is unsure about the mental state of the patient and even so still releases him again. This is a cycle of care and release. They'll both be battling each other in, with the doctor holding out hope for the patient to truly recover. At the conclusion of this first few lines, we hear him switch to the very first tape he recorded with the patient, and it's unclear if this was before, during, or after the trial, but it is giving us this limited insight into the patient's relationship with his wife and how it was something that was so wholesome and pure and something that really gave him meaning. There's commentary on how this unintentional act of violence has left the patient catatonic and a prisoner in his own body, as if the patient himself is stuck in this constant state of living in a night terror he cannot escape. This tape also offers insight into how the doctor sees and notices this lack of something inside the patient. And while the doctor is expressing this thing he's noticing, he's also expressing his hope and an ability to resolve this feeling no matter how hard he tries. While this track really just gives away so much about the story, I think it's really important and smart that they started it this way. It clearly lays out the intentions of the doctor. The doctor is someone who genuinely wants to help and care for the patient. And starting in the middle of this album gives us that view that the doctor is someone who actually cares for the patient, but also highlights the limitations of care that medical professionals can provide. The only singing done in this track introduces us to one of the multiple repeating themes and lyrics in this album, and that is The lines I wear around my wrist are there to prove that I exist, which currently don't really mean anything to you. But we can, in this moment with this interview with the doctor, interpret that as the literal representation of the patient's existence via the information conveyed on his wrist bracelet at the hospital, i.e. name, date of birth, etc., and all of that. Or we can also interpret it as the figurative representation that the patient hasn't lost himself to the act he committed that night, or even that the things that he is experiencing is real. The track ends with the doctor telling the patient that his feeling of something that is in the center of his torso, behind his eyes, and in the back of his head that's been eating him alive is actually grief. And with the patient coldly replying, "Don't tell me what it is," with a clear sense of denial coming in his delivery. And spoiler alert, the doctor is spot on with his assessment. However, the patient doesn't see it this way. But more on that later. With that song's conclusion, we are now into track 2, Dreaming, which puts us at the beginning of our story, the night the patient murdered his wife. The patient is plagued with horrible night terrors, and the first verse really shows how normal these night terrors have actually become for him, hinting at an underlying struggle with mental health that they ever really go into or highlight, but it's there. Some nights he describes himself as falling, formless and shapeless, which I feel represents just regular, nothing abnormal to it sleeping, which is followed by the warning that some nights you're better off alone, stuck inside your own body, suffocating and screaming, "Wake up," which is akin to how night terrors present themselves. And again, as we know, that's during one of those episodes that he violently murders his wife in his sleep. What I really love about this song particularly is the juxtaposition of the choruses, where the first chorus is the patient and his wife passionately enjoying each other. And honestly, it's up for debate if the patient was dreaming of this while harming his wife. The second is the recounting of the patient smothering his wife violently. The song, to me, is so smartly written because of the amount of layered meanings that these lyrics have in them. For example, the lines like "this coma kiss is infinite" could be relating to the dream intimacy of kissing his wife versus the reality that she's forever asleep because of his actions, which is then followed by "and I may take your tongue if you stay," which to me symbolizes a few things. The most obvious is from the patient's perspective, which is an almost lovey-dovey hyperbolic thing given the first chorus, which discusses making love to his wife. The second being referencing a common euphemism for silencing someone, aka killing them. The third being the taking of someone's ability to speak and, in essence, someone's voice. This album will center around this concept very heavily when it comes to the patient's wife, to the point that he will do anything just to hear her no matter what the cost. This song also introduces some recurring lyrics and ideas, the first being the lyric "Tonight it's worse, tonight the screaming hurts." While at an initial pass-by can be interpreted at him screaming at himself to wake up in the context of this song, I truly believe the reason why the screaming is worse is because he's unconsciously hearing the screams of his wife while he's smothering her. The second concept introduced would be becoming or being inseparable from his wife, which we will see play out with his memories of her, the grief of what he did that night, and ultimately why he believes he can be with her again. Third is the lyric "someone call an ambulance because something's not right." This lyric to me is an interesting inclusion into this album because it is a direct quote from their last song of their previously released album, "Make Yourself Sick." That song is called "Yeah, No, I Know." Now, this could be a tongue-in-cheek reference to their last album, but if you'll indulge me in a blue curtain moment later, I actually think the song slots in a non-canon way into this album, but we'll get to that later. Sleeping or dreaming are going to be a thread that's going to be interwoven throughout this album. However, I don't think they're a main theme to focus on. I mean, obviously, it heavily plays into this album and the actions that happened, but rather I think for the rest of the album, they're basically just going to be a catalyst for events or transitions into scenery or things to take place. whether that be the patient waking up somewhere or it being used as a means to communicate ideas to him. Overall, I really think that this song is one of the best songs of this entire album to listen to multiple times, because after listening to the album in its entirety, you generally get a lot more from this first song particularly. Waking is the third track of the album where, you guessed it, the patient, now awake, has to confront the horror of what he has done before him. He has no choice but to sit alone with his wife near him and wait for the police and ambulance to arrive. And that, to me, as someone who's been married for quite some time, would be debilitating beyond like any reason. Like I would not be okay. Like I would not be okay. The chorus to me of the song is actually really interesting because we see how the patient pleads for everything that has taken place to be a dream. Having fully experienced night terrors and nightmares, it's as if he's trying to convince himself that he's still stuck inside of one of these parasomnia episodes. That what he's experiencing is so horrific for him to wrap his mind around that it needs to be one of these nights where he is screaming, "Wake up" at himself. We see this in Make This a Dream Because You Really Can't Believe That She's Gone. I'm Not Here and This Isn't Happening. Here we witness the patient rapidly switch between some of the stages of grief, mainly denial and bargaining, and over again coupled with an outburst of anger where he tears through his room, shattering bottles of his wife's perfumes on the wall. And with him smashing these bottles of his wife's perfume onto the wall, we get another repeating reference that we're going to see throughout the story, which is the smell of her perfume struggles to cover everything. Now, these lyrics aren't specifically mentioned in this song. They are mentioned verbatim in the next song and on the final song. However, this idea, this concept is going to be throughout the rest of the album. We're going to see it littered in other songs. It's often coupled with this idea of covering something, whether that be walls or everything, which is what the patient calls it. Now, everything to me, more than likely, will mean the memory of that night, his guilt, and his wife. There's another motif I feel is introduced with this song, and this could totally be like a blue curtain moment for me, but that is the presentation of walls as insight into the patient's feelings. When he's breaking bottles of her perfume on the walls in this rampage, we're told that he's christening the walls with it. And if you're not familiar with the concept of christening, it can either be akin to baptism, which is generally like infant baptism, or to name or dedicate something like a ship, which is traditionally done by breaking a bottle of champagne on it for whatever reason that means. Baptism in the Christian faith is an outward expression or display of choosing to follow Jesus by symbolically being washed of sins through the act of dunking a person in water and being theoretically born again new, guilt-free as they are raised up out of the water. This act of breaking her bottles of perfume on the walls, to me, has this double meaning outside of the rage he's feeling. One being the coupling of two things. Perfume is expensive or so here. I don't really buy perfume or anything like that. But like, I feel like perfume is expensive from what I remember. But it's generally, let's just go with that. Perfume is generally valuable and stored in decorative glass, which is ornate, beautiful, and fragile. So we can see this idea of him smashing these valuable, beautiful, and fragile bottles of perfume against the walls as representing the act of him murdering his wife, because she was to him valuable, beautiful, and something that was supposed to be protected. The other meaning to me would be the one that furthers this idea of him and his wife are now inseparable. He's literally staining the walls with her smell, one that would be comforting and familiar to him. These walls that held all of this like love and all of these shared memories of these intimate moments together now are the only witnesses to the death of that love and their final moments together. And if we see this idea of walls as representative of his emotions or feelings, to me, this is as if he's permanently trying to keep the memory of her and in their love with him forever, while also trying to cover them, in essence, to prevent them and him from witnessing what happened. Almost as if he is blinding the walls that saw him do this thing, so that the only thing that they can see or the only thing that he can remember from that night is covered by this perfume. Patient experiences an extreme panic attack where he struggles to breathe, guiltily stating that he doesn't deserve to even take these breaths at all, which is then followed by him descending into this catatonia as the last thing he remembers is his body shutting down while the first responders he called finally enter his home. I find the perspective shifting from first person to third person in this moment really interesting, because to me it is a subtle display of the patient dissociating from this event. The patient is catatonic by the end of the song, which makes sense that they would have like this disconnection from themselves in the memory of what happened, which to me is also kind of an interesting like storytelling device, because he is disconnected from these events in that night and catatonic, which causes the audience who's listening to this event become also disconnected from the events and everything that takes place after that, which leads us into the next song about the trial. Sentencing is track 4 and probably the most straightforward chapter, because it details his trial, his first interactions and impressions with the doctor, and his eventual admission into the hospital. This doesn't mean it's not filled with some of important details or references. It's just a very straightforward song. The introduction of this song starts with the perfect concept returning almost as if the patient is trying to focus only on this specific smell as he's confronted with the evidence of what happened that night. So again, it starts off with the smell of her perfume is struggling to cover everything. It's also here we get the first mention of something singing to him. It's interesting to me because when taking this opening into context of the entire album, it plants this idea that there has been an almost ethereal song etched into his being since that night. And while the patient seemingly is trying to cover up the memory of what happened by concentrating on his former wife's perfume, the ringing room, being the courtroom, is singing to him, "I told you so." He's being confronted firsthand with this evidence of what he's done in the courtroom and now has to process it. This is the part of our story where we see the patient acknowledge that while he himself was the one who killed his wife, he's unwilling to give in to the idea that it was intentional or malicious, or as he says, unwilling to accept evil as my own personal and sentient will, which to me demonstrates the patient as being unable to deal with what he's done and rather decides again to separate action and intention, to dissociate himself from that night. We see this in the chorus lines, "Nothing makes sense anymore when murder's just a mistake you have made." We also see that in the chorus the idea of the sick and guilty man being born again with conscience saved, as if hearkening back to the act of christening these walls with his wife's perfume, a smell where we see he's using to cover up the memory of what happened, which allows him to separate himself from feeling the guilt of what he did, thereby unburdening his conscience. That was a lot to say. Being born again paralleling the aspect of christening or being baptized, which not only symbolizes the outward expression of faith we talked about earlier, but also the guilt of his crime/sin being washed or removed from him. His conscience being saved in this case as a recognition that what he did was neither intentional nor malicious, which led to a judicial precedent allowing him to be committed to the hospital to receive mental health care versus convicted criminally and sent to jail. This is also where we'll be introduced to the doctor in the story, and we hear his first initial insights into the patient, which, calls back to introducing. There were implausibilities he couldn't place. It was obvious that there was something more to this patient. Something had been missed. It's this hole I can see in each of his eyes where all the events that happen in this real world just kind of fall through. I think the doctor acknowledging that there was something to the patient that had been missed hints at, again, this underlying, undiagnosed condition that the patient has, which, caused the night terrors. But whether that's the actual case or not is neither here nor there, because the album doesn't really go into it. The doctor also begins this personal quest to fill or fix these holes or this emptiness that lives within the patient, referencing back again to the tape we listened to in introducing with his initial analysis of him. The trial ends with the patient committed to the hospital and catatonic. The next song we're going to talk about is probably the most known song from the album, that being Medicating. It It was the single that they released. It's a very catchy and popular song, and honestly, it's probably the one that I would introduce people to first when listening to this album because it's just such a good song. I mean, all of them are good songs, but this one's really good. In Medicating, we see the patient waking up in the hospital as if for the first time since the trial. Prior to this opening moment of the song, we can assume he was catatonic for an undetermined amount of time. The reason why I say it's as if he's waking up is because we're seeing like almost this sense of mental clarity we've not seen in the patient up until this point. You know, he's demonstrating this sense of like mental and emotional clarity that we could probably attribute to, you know, therapy, medication, and the stable environment he finds himself in. When he's waking up, he's still stuck and can't escape this scent or perfume of his dead wife. He's still focused and transfixed on it. See the patient trying to figure out in this first verse how to use the doctor in order to be released back to the life he had before he was committed. A life that we know won't be the same for him. Remember how I said walls to me give us insight into the patient's feelings? Well, here we have the white walls of the hospital. White being something of a blank canvas that coincides with the patient's clarity that he's currently experiencing due to his care. White also can be seen as something empty and yet endless when stared directly into due to it being devoid of any other color. And let's be honest here. Hospitals kind of try their best with decorations. Like they put up like these arbitrary like landscapes, like maybe local landscapes of stuff, and like this abstract art piece, and then like portraits of animals or whatever to like really like give this sense of like homeliness to it. But honestly, those things still pale in comparison to the things that we decorate our walls with, our memories, our trinkets, and our photographs. Those types of things, they pale in comparison to those things. So we see the patient in this environment that is safe and stable, but also empty and endless feeling to him, which the patient believes is making his condition worse, and that he no longer needs the walls to keep himself or others safe. These walls welcomed him in their sterility, now are just empty canvases for his pain to be displayed. They're a physical reminder of the emptiness that now resides within him. The chorus has the patient pleading with the doctor, saying, "Doctor, doctor, what am I in for? Can't you see that I don't need this place? I don't need these walls. I'm no threat at all." Essentially saying that he's like no threat to anybody else. He's not a threat to himself. Like he's totally cool. He doesn't need this place anymore. Like super trust me, bro moment, which to me is kind of interesting because the chorus has him question why he's even in there in the first place, even though from the very beginning of the song, he knows exactly why he's there. As the chapter progresses, we see the patient desiring to leave this hospital setting and return to some sense of normality. He wants to get back to his job. He wants to get back to his life. And on a personal level, as someone who has struggled with mental health stuff, not particularly in this case, but more along the lines of like depression and OCD, sometimes, although psychiatric facilities can be helpful, they can be at times, they almost feel wrong because they offer this sense of stability and support that generally you're not used to. And so as weird and logically like crazy as it is for me to say, the chaos of struggling with depression and OCD feels safer than not struggling with those things. And so sometimes, and as someone who has been admitted to the hospital, when that happens, it almost feels like you're trying to leave this hospital setting because it feels like this obstacle that is in the way of you returning to your normal life versus the actual things that got you there that are the obstacles from you having a sense of stability and normalcy. And so we see that the patient is somewhat struggling with this concept that there is this almost sanitary emptiness to these hospital settings, and while in theory they're safe, much like the walls that the patient finds himself surrounded by, they can feel very devoid of any connection to the outside world. We see in the lines, "Yes, I know what I've done and I regret it every day," that the patient acknowledges what he's done, but it still feels disconnected and dismissive, like those words, while true, are just a means to an end in his real current goal, which is to be discharged from the hospital. It's as if he's trying to say whatever he needs to say in order to get the doctor to release him, and honestly saying things like, if I could make things right, you know I'd find a way follows into that as well. The patient then plays off the sense of emptiness in the halls of the hospital here as a means to potentially manipulate the doctor to release him, almost as if being here is making him worse, and we, the audience, know that the doctor possesses this drive to cure or fix this emptiness within the patient. And I believe that it's this emotional connection and desire of the doctor to fix this emptiness in the patient that allows the patient to be successful in convincing the doctor to release him. And while the patient is emphatically stating, "Doctor, I can't thank you enough. Doctor, you won't regret this," the sounds of clapping are heard in the background. We end medicating with him being released and sent back to his attempt at normal life and routine. To me, again, the song is arguably the most accessible song in the entire album. It's super catchy. Like the clapping is amazing. It's just really, really well done. And if you're trying to get somebody into this album, or if you are unsure about listening to this album yourself, this is the one I recommend you starting on. Purging is the next track, and for me, it is what has caused me and spurred me on to dissect and really, really take a deep look at this album and honestly want to talk about it, because this is the song that I talk to almost everybody about this album to first. Like, I know I told people to introduce, like listen to Medicating first, but Purging to me is a song that I love talking about. This track takes place immediately after the patient was released, and you can kind of get a glimpse of how going from super structured and safe hospital routines and environments to true freedom can affect a person, especially when they're not ready to be released. He's struggling with sleep, relating it to something akin to being like a zombie. And let me tell you, as someone who has struggled with sleep so much in their life, that is a super accurate description. And it's in the midst of this inability to sleep, the patient describes himself as going to the kitchen, grabbing a marker, and tracing a path or cut lines on his wrists. And it's here where we finally get the revelation to where the lyrics from the first track come from. The lines I wear around my wrist are there to prove that I exist. I think this song reveals the patient's ultimate goal of wanting to be released. He's going to attempt to kill himself in order to pay penance for what he's done. He was never able to let go of this guilt of this thing, this horrific thing that he's done, and the only way that he can feel to make it right, calling back to medicating, is to end his life. For the patient, death is not only like a penance to be paid, but a release from the horrific memories of his wife. It seems that he can no longer think of her in any other way from what happened that night, that much like the walls are stained in her perfume, his memories of her are forever stained by his violence. The patient then begins to muse on this idea of how we take for granted all the things that make us who we are. And after being in the hospital for an undetermined amount of time, I believe that the implication here is he's trying to return to his former life and see all of these things that made him who he was before he was removed from it, almost as if he'd forgotten them, and to take that a step farther, that there is nothing here now in this physical world that brings him peace that he once had and once took for granted. One of the things that really surprised me is that, like, he doesn't wait. He immediately goes back to work, and, like, we get this, like, hint of, like, paranoia that he's struggling with, feeling as if everybody there is watching him. You see this with the lines, "Get up, get dressed, go to work. They all know who you are. They can't believe you'd show up here, but that's just who they are." Followed by him taking his workstation with the lines, "Set up shop at your machine, calibrate, remember who you are," almost as if he is trying to remind himself that he is more than what people perceive him to be, and using this moment to calibrate the machine as a way to calibrate himself and to make himself grounded and remember who he actually is. All of these lines are sung in what I like to describe as like a dream-like feel. the way the music plays together, the effects used on the vocals. It's almost as if the patient is continuing this concept of being the waking, walking dead, that everything up until this point since release has been ethereal and distant to him, which is directly in contrast with how the next few lines are presented to us, like musically and lyrically. Here lies clarity in a perfect grave comprised of perfect steel. The perfect blade glows a perfect white against the perfect lines from this perfect night. I'm the perfect picture of complacency, and that's all I feel. The way these lyrics are sung are so calm and peaceful and clear. We are experiencing this complacency that the patient himself is feeling. He sees the blade of this freshly calibrated machine and realizes that in this moment he can end this constant nightmare he's living. I don't think he specifically went into work intending to end his life. Rather, I think he understood that this is a way to readily accomplish this penance, and he found peace in it. And that peaceful acceptance that we feel from this music and from him singing those lines is so abruptly shifted into chaotic instrumentation as the patient proceeds to cut his hands off in the machine while thinking, almost screaming to himself, "The lines I wear around my wrist are there to prove that I exist," which essentially acts as this moment to prove that he is in control of his life. It took me almost a decade, a freaking decade of listening to this before I realized a subtle sound cue in the background, and it's one that I cannot get excited talking about, because I just want to talk to everybody about it. But anyways, okay, I'm getting sidetracked. So remember how when I said that a concept albums have to not only tell their stories lyrically, but also set the scene and such musically, which, some of these dreamlike sequences, the way some of the staccato instrumentation is done and all that stuff leading up to this point. This is demonstrated so clearly at the 2-minute and 34-ish second mark, where we hear the sound of a saw blade, almost going from one side of the headphone to the other side of the headphone, repeated twice. Which is such a horrifically cool detail that isn't prominent. It has a lot of attention. It doesn't have a lot of attention drawn to it. It's just there to help drive this visceral moment in the patient's life, helping the audience, us, both visualize it and hear this moment. And I think that is so freaking cool to me. Patient comments as everything is slowing down after he commits this act, that he says that his fellow workers are realizing what's happening before their eyes, and him in this moment finding this personal peace and knowing that his hands that so lovingly held his wife, now described as claws, will never kill again. Claws is an interesting description to me because claws tend to pinch and squeeze and be used to hold things in place to attack or defend or feed, and it's as if the patient is connecting these things or these ideas to his hands that latched onto his wife that night that were unable to let go. We see next that those people working with him scramble to help the patient, and I think it's interesting that the patient describes them as a pack of bewildered wolves, and it still kind of plays into this paranoia to me, that the people who are there rushing to his side to help him are still described in some way as predatory and out to get him, framed as opportunistic or antagonistic predators because they're out to save his life when his ultimate goal is to lose it. And so they're descending on him much like wolves descend on a wounded animal. The last lines, "and I fall," being repeated over and over again, has a double meaning here. One, he's, quite literally falling after doing that. And two, this marks his beginning into his descent into madness. Not only is he physically falling, but he's mentally begun to take the first steps off the ledge of sanity to fall deeper and deeper into delusion. I would describe this track not only as a really good example of how a concept album can take minor sounds, in introducing the very first track, and use the tape turning sounds, him replacing the tape. I think this is also a really good example of a track taking subtle sound cues to really build into the story. But this track to me symbolizes the turning point like the no way back turning point for the patient's mental health and his grasp on reality. The next track, Relapsing, is where the patient is waking up in the hospital after cutting off his own hands. This song starts off with the chorus of the track, and it is sung by a completely new voice. This one being the voice of his wife. Beautifully and hauntingly sung by then keyboardist Cara Dupuy. I'm really bad at pronouncing things, so please forgive me because I slaughtered that pronunciation. But anyways, this isn't the first time that we hear her singing on an album. This album does a really good job of layering vocals. However, this is the first time that she's taking a lead role in singing, signifying to us that his guilt, this guilt and emptiness the patient has felt, has fully manifested into delusion inside of him. Chorus goes, last call at the hospital, you slept through it all, and these four walls warn you that your surgery, it might not be the key to fix the memory of you and me. Last call is generally attributed to like bars and restaurants, and essentially them saying, hey, this is your last chance to get drinks before we close the bar. Now, last call in the context of this, when it comes to the hospital, feels like it's the last call for the patient to like get help. This is his last chance to receive help. And honestly, it would be like very easy to perceive the things that are being said or the things that the patient believes as his wife telling him or encouraging him to do the horrible things that he's eventually going to do. But for me, I actually believe that the voice of her that he is hearing are the last remnants of his sanity and hope, or even his desires to make things right from that night. Again, we're presented with walls, and to me, in this instance, they represent the patient's inability to escape what he's done that night. The once complacent and peacefulness associated with the last track is now met with the warning that his surgery or attempted suicide isn't the solution to his guilt, his shame, or the trauma revolving around his memory of his wife. That the empty walls he so longed to escape from in medicating truly were canvases for his pain and guilt. And these walls are a continued reminder that he can never escape what he's done. The patient begins to talk to the doctor about what he's done and what led him to removing his hands. And with our insight into the patient's thoughts from the previous tracks, we know that he was seeking some relief for the memories of what he's done. He's experienced these almost uncontrolled dreamlike states of violence that defy explanation, and in turn is now confronting this notion that his existence might serve some other unknowable purpose. We see his mind struggling with how to rationalize what's happened to him and apply purpose or reason to it. There must have been a reason he survived, even if it's unknowable to him currently. To me, this is almost a mirror of medicating, where the patient questions the doctor for what he's done in a physical sense, where now the patient is trying to understand what he's in for in an existential sort of way. Like, while in medicating, he's in this sense of denial and distancing. Here he is almost trying to find something to hold on to for meaning and purpose. I find it interesting that when he's talking to the doctor about what happened the night he murdered his wife, he tells the doctor now that he can't see what happened that night, rather he hears it, which is kind of in direct contrast to some of the things that he's expressed before, where he could only focus on the scent of his wife's perfume that he smashed on the walls, or her scent was covering everything. That he has no visual memory of anything that took place that night. And as someone who has, although not particularly of this nature, experienced traumatic things and has PTSD, aka post-traumatic stress disorder, because of it, I can relate to this in a way. It's hard to explain to someone who, thankfully, has never experienced something traumatic how going through that causes your brain to find ways to cope with it. Some ways are completely blocking out the memory, like you have no recollection of what happened that night. There are instances where the mind almost puts you in a third-person perspective, like you are an observer to the events happening to you, whether that means you're floating above or you're far behind or they're in a distance. You are not emotionally or physically experiencing them, rather you are very distant from them and observing them. Other ways can be blocking out visual aspects like the patient, and keeping some form of like auditory or tactile or fragrant memory associated with it. And it's with that realization the patient has that he can only hear what happened that night, we get the final line of the first verse, where we see that the patient equates the screams of that night, the screams of his wife, to a song, one that's so awful because of what happened, and perfect because it was his wife who was the one singing it. These screams are now the last audible memories he has of his wife's voice, and to call all the way back to dreaming, the tongue he took while she laid now is this haunting song that he hears that will in turn take and consume him. The next few lines, Doctor, I don't know what I'm going to do. I need the song to be shouted out and to be heard by everyone. It's like each word and every chord refuses to be ignored. This is bigger than me, but with no hands and even less skill, I don't know how it will ever come out. The patient expresses to the doctor this almost compulsory need to have everyone sing the song he now hears, even though he is at a loss for how to make it happen. I believe that this is what the patient is talking about all the way back in introducing the first song, where we can hear him tell the doctor that something is eating him alive from the inside out, where the doctor astutely recognizes it as grief. The patient doesn't seem to believe it to be so. And as a side note, this verse is also that slight commentary and fourth wall break for the band in terms of creating music. Again, and honestly, it can be applied to any form of artistry across the board. There is this frustration as artists where we see and hear a thing that we're trying to create inside of our mind and struggling to translate it from brain to paper or instrument or whatever your medium is perfectly. And this like handless patient symbolizes oftentimes the disconnect between an artist's creative mind and the physical reality of making it happen. And I just think that's a really cool like fourth wall meta commentary on creating things. What comes next is the patient stating that he believes this song is actually the voice of his wife that he's hearing, that these screams of terror that have haunted him are in essence the last remnants of his wife that he has. But instead of confronting the memory of that night, a memory that he constantly has relived, the patient elects to rearrange his pain in such a way to bring out beauty. That if this is the only way that he and his wife can be together, then who is he to stop it? And not only does he question his agency in it, he starts to delude himself into believing that this will bring her back to him and undo what he's done. Because not only does he need her in his life, he needs this to be a reality. He also says to the doctor, the saddest songs can sing themselves and just sing along, is more than likely the patient commenting that like his sadness, loss, his guilt, whatever you want to call it, all this negativity are all going to persist regardless of what he does. And as he moves into this like new line of delusion, he's inviting those feelings to sing this new song with him, leading him to this conclusion. So if that's the answer, then the question is the trigger, and I'm just the firing pin. Yeah, I'm just a messenger, doomed to detonate on delivery. The patient is now diving further and further into this delusion that he can bring his wife back, realizing that death is the answer or the key in his mind to fixing the memories of his wife. And although he already knows the answer, he's unaware of the right way to get it. And once he figures that out, it will trigger the events to bring his wife back. But not only that, there is this like sense of being in this ethereal calling that he is unable to refuse, and therefore he's not responsible for what may come out of this path of self-destruction. He's just the messenger to deliver the answer of death to those destined to receive it. He himself becoming this instrument in the ensemble that will comprise this song he feels compelled to share with the world and make them sing along with. The track ends with the voice of his wife repeating the chorus almost as if she's trying to deliver this warning to her husband that this is his last call to not embark on this path, and that where he's going may not be what's going to fix what happened. The next track is Recovering, and it's similar to medicating in a sense that the patient is under supervisory care and doing what he can to be released. However, unlike medicating, which was framed with this sense of like hopefulness, Recovering is wrought with bitterness and despair. The first verse goes, "Old habits die hard, growing bitter from trying to be broken, while these comfortable routines are smothered with affection. Well, I choose to switch between the two. I choose whatever convinces you that I should be allowed to slip through the cracks and get back to the living. These walls are unforgiving. Send someone to check on me and take notes on my recovery." The first verse highlights how far he's slipping into this delusion of the song that he's hearing. It's to the point where he realizes the part that he has to play in order to begin the writing process of this song. That part being one of a broken man who is recovering from not only losing his hands, but dealing with the guilt of his horrendous act. And the whole aim of that part is to be released from this care that he feels so smothered by. This touches on what I talked about earlier with wanting to get back to the sense of normalcy and connection to the outside world. This also, you could probably also draw a connection from him feeling smothered by the care of people to Waking, where he is talking about how he can't breathe, he doesn't deserve to take these breaths. So in some way feeling this compounded guilt that he doesn't feel like he should be cared for because of the things that he's done. Again, this guilt eating him from inside. We're also confronted with the concept of walls yet again, and this time, while in the hospital where the walls were a blank canvases for his pain, they are now seen as unforgiving. This obviously echoing the constant feeling he is experiencing whenever he thinks of his wife or remembers that night, which is interesting to me because he isn't being punished here. He seems to be in an environment where he is receiving care and genuine help, but because of this overwhelming amount of guilt, it's smothering to him, and he feels undeserving of it. We see in the chorus the patient thinking to himself, "One pill will get me through the day, but I take two anyway. When I take 3 pills, the song begins to play, one that won't go away." Which shows that he's begun abusing his medication and alcohol in order to not only numb himself throughout the day, but to hear the song he's constantly living, or simply put, to hear what he believes is the voice of his wife, which I think is confirmed in the second half of the chorus. And even though I know 1 pill will get me through the day, I take 2 anyway. When I mix 4 pills with a drink, the song starts to play. It's in the back of my head and it's everywhere, and it's all I can think about. The patient is self-aware of his struggle as he falls further and further into his addictions. He's also aware that if he doesn't hide it from those who are observing and caring for him, he won't be released to share this song to the world. And all of this subterfuge and addiction has him mirroring the catatonic state he was in the night told to us in Waking. He himself says, "But when unsuspected, addiction is under the radar and anything goes, so here I sit, comatose almost." The song shifts into this almost dreamlike musical sequence of the patient telling us what's been happening to him, saying, "I float between hospitals and halfway homes, between halfway living and halfway lying. And I know all the awful things that no one needs to know. I take my medicine and make them believe that I'm a better man." Floating to me feels like a small callback to Dreaming, where he discusses what it's like to have night terrors or to sleep, where he's like falling formless and shapeless, and he's like anchoring this floating feeling as he's moving between hospitals and halfway homes, again reinforcing this comatose state that he resides in. The halfway living and the halfway lying is kind of a play on words. Not only is he lying to the people helping him, definitely falling into that anything goes mentality that I was talking about earlier, lying can also mean the act of physically lying down, digging deeper into this dreamlike comatose state he's in. We see him committing to taking his medicine and keeping up the charade until he's free to express all of these awful things that no one needs to know. Those awful things meaning his addiction, his plans after release, and what it's like to live with this guilt. The song ends with one more chorus and these lines screamed. "But still I hear the song. It's everywhere, surrounding me and ringing in my ears. this song will call for sedative, sacrifice, and sing-alongs. So sing along. The last time we heard something ringing in the patient's ears was way back in sentencing, where he's in the courtroom confronted with the evidence of what he's done. So the song, this guilt, this reality that what he's done will always be with him has consumed every part of him. The patient now beginning to realize that this perfect song, his perfect song, calls for sedatives, sacrifices, and sing-alongs. Moving on from this passive idea that sad songs can sing along to themselves to an active call for everyone to participate in the song he's going to compose himself. Which, those three things will make sense in just a minute, but if you'll indulge me for one moment, because I'm going to do something heretical to the story being told, and because this is my video and my oddly overthinking and obsessiveness, I'm going to do whatever I want to insert this non-canonized track right here that I think just brings more out of the story. Blue curtain moment, engage! Remember back when I mentioned the song from Boys Not Out's previous album, Make Yourself Sick? Yeah, no, I know. Well, if you take that song and you place it between recovering and the next song, composing, it almost offers a weird insight into the patient's mental break. Or at the very least, the way these lyrics and the story being told to us line up so, like, just too coincidental for me to ignore it. Although I am sure that this wasn't the intentions of the band, it's just uncanny to me how well they just kind of line up here. And I chose between these two songs for a reason, that being the way the music is composed. You can close your eyes and almost see the patient in his addiction-fueled days, walking the streets, sitting in his room, or in the hospital, reliving that night and committing further and further to what he believes he needs to do. And his mental degradation feels fully expressed in how the chaotic nature of the guitars clash towards the end. Now I'm going to be going more line by line with this track, just to basically further rationalize, justify, and ground my conspiracy about it. The first verse starts off with something you should immediately recognize. Someone call an ambulance because something's not right. It's all going wrong tonight. In between the bottom of this bottle and you, I think I'm running into rock bottom. Now you see where that line comes from. Someone call an ambulance because something's not right. It originally comes from this song. Again, this is hearkening to the patients calling an ambulance for what happened with it's all going wrong tonight as a continuation of the previous thought or feeling. It also just could be the patient thinking to himself that everything in his life is going wrong, so someone needs to call an ambulance because something's not right, i.e. he's not right. The next two lines, in between the bottom of this bottle and you, I think I'm running into rock bottom, which to me feels like the patient's struggle of dealing with his guilt and how he realizes that this life isn't sustainable, that his addiction to the medication he's abusing and to the sound of what he believes is his wife's voice is rapidly moving him into the lowest place he's ever been in his entire life. The next lines, this time I'm in over my head from counting times that I've said, is repeated, which can be tied to the previous track where the patient believes all of this is spinning out of control. He's repeating over and over again that something's not right and is aware enough to know that living this cycle of abuse will be the end of him. And this track does a really good job to set us up as the audience to kind of feel and be in this mindset with how the instrumentation feels chaotic, and they're screaming and they're singing, and there's just a feeling that something definitely is not right. And after some time, the instrumentation cleans up and becomes clearer, and we get these lines sung very cleanly. It took time to fashion this news from fine threads of self-abuse, but it fits your neck perfectly securely. Your heels hit heavy on the hardwood, not that it did any good. My love, you've been a constant headache for me. This again references his own battle of self-mutilation, guilt, and addiction, while at the same time addressing the memories of that night and how this act was out of his control. You can imagine her struggling and pleading to break free from her unaware husband, and the patient now lives with the screaming and the song that plays endlessly inside of his head that he cannot get rid of. And oh my gosh, that's just haunting. Next we have, if it came down to this act or one more near heart attack, you wouldn't have hope in hell, my darling. It all comes down to this act. Don't stop the heartbeat counting. So this is where we can kind of get an idea that the patient is finally accepting what he believes he must do in order to begin to get this song he's been hearing out of his head. And he is realizing that he must sacrifice people to get those lyrics, which means it's either sacrificing people or himself dying. And I think it's interesting that he also says you wouldn't have a hope in hell, my darling, because we'll see 2 songs from now that the first line is abandon all hope, ye who enter here, which is a reference to the Inferno portion of the Dante's The Divine Comedy, where those words are inscribed over the gates of hell, something that we'll definitely expand on when we get to that track. Next we have, I know that I'm responsible for this, and I'll miss you. Maybe in time, I'll find out what it is that I'm supposed to do. Again, referencing the guilt and shame that he feels whenever he thinks about what he's done to his wife, while also trying to figure out how to make things right, or in other words, how to atone for what he's done to her. Those lyrics are followed by, I've made a million messes and I'll make a million more. Trust me, baby, I'm not the man you're searching for. Which then falls back into the similar instrumentation of the beginning of the song and the lyrics, someone call an ambulance, being repeated over and over again. Like we get to see how the patient now begins to commit to this compulsion to appease this song that haunts him. A song that he feels connects him to his wife, and in this process, recognizing that he's not the man he was when he was with her, that now he's this broken shell of a person who has been fumbling through hospitals and halfway homes, trying to desperately grasp on to anything that can reunite them together. The song ends with a drawn-out instrumentation that has this cathartic sense of cacophony to it. You can almost feel or see a montage of the patient wandering through the streets and in and out of hospitals, visiting like the doctor and all these people who are caring for them, battling addiction, and finally giving in to what he feels he must do. Murder people to write this song and bring it to the world. And I think that instrumentation, that cacophony of sounds, pairs really well with the next track, Composing, because Composing has a long, calmer intro which directly contrasts it, almost as if he is coming out of all of this addiction with this understanding of what he's supposed to be doing, and therefore he is more clear and focused and guided in it. Composing is where we see the patient has transitioned from struggling with this sense of personal agency and confusion over his life after his wife's death to focused and driven in order to create this song that has been omnipresent in his life. Everything he is doing now is to serve that song, which I think is one of the reasons it opens up with the chorus. It's all about the song in my head, the one where the audience is all dead. Remember in Recovering where the patient said, sing along? Well, that kind of me felt out of place, and especially in the context of everything. Like, who was the patient actually talking to? Was he, like, there was nobody there? And it's in Composing we actually get that answer. We see the patient has committed completely to this idea of an audience, and that they are the ones to sing the song that lives within him. And it is here that we discover that we are in fact the audience, and the patient now has acknowledged our existence, even having us begin to take an active role in his story. This again calls to this whole meta commentary of the struggle an artist has with transitioning their vision to paper, video, or sound, because the reality is, if there is no one to sing or observe these artistic creations, then in essence, they don't exist. And by us participating in these songs, aka listening to the album and singing along, we are the embodiment of this ethereal experience the patient is having. You see, the audience has been present all along in the background of the patient's life. If you go back and listen to the previous tracks, you can hear multiple voices joining in and emphasizing specific lines. We have, in essence, been singing along already to the patient's madness and delusion. And I think This is also why the Doctor himself never sings in this album. Spoiler alert, he never sings once in this album. His vocal lines are only spoken word. He can't hear the song, therefore he cannot sing along or even join in singing it. The patient has this huge shift in bitterness and guile from the care that he's received in recovering to thankfulness and humility in composing. At least that's what he wants people to think. The patient is genuinely actually thankful for the people in his life, but not because, they've stuck by him, helped him recover, get him on his feet and all that kind of stuff or anything like that. He's thankful because he can then use them as a way to compose this song. We see this in lines like, I beg family for forgiveness, and now for the first time together we'll witness, together we'll live the song I've been living incessantly. The begging of forgiveness from friends and family is less about, the murdering of his wife, getting closure, or even the roller coaster of hospital stays that he's caused everybody to be put through, but more of an apology that he has to use them in such a way to bring his song to life. That way, being poisoning and killing them. I think it's interesting he invites them to sing with him rather than actually participating in dying himself for this song. This calls back to where he believes that he's just a messenger, a trigger, or just a tool meant to bring about the circumstances to create a song he's been living. We see the processes in which the patient accomplishes the murder of his victim, which seem to be people he personally knows, in the lines. So come over to my house, catch up over dinner. We're having strychnine and sirloin, port wine and paint thinner. You'll convulse to the chorus, it's the song of a sinner. Essentially what I'm calling using MLM tactics. You know the one where someone you haven't talked to in a long time messaged you like out of nowhere on whatever social media platform they happen to find you on, and all of a sudden seems to have an interest in your life only to try and sell you on a timeshare or buying candles or whatever thing is trendy and new. But in this case, it's less of a sales pitch and more of a, you're going to get poisoned and die. The Song of the Sinner being a song of the patient himself due to killing people, and one that is composed of screaming, crying, choking, convulsing, or basically recreating the last moments of his wife. What follows is the patient clearing the table through dreamlike vocals, commenting on how this won't be the last time, followed by a haunting choir repeating that line, signaling that he's murdered multiple people before this point. And when you actually think about it, it's really chilling, because the strength of the voices of this audience are loud enough to materialize vocally in his mind, as if to further strengthen his resolve and commitment. The patient then moves from singular to plural pronouns when discussing the writing of the song, and whether he means that he and his wife, or that's him and the audience are the ones creating it, is ambiguous at this point. But what isn't ambiguous is his commitment to bring this song into the world. It becomes everything to him and has consumed every aspect of his life. And because it's consumed every aspect of his life, there's no easy way to say this part. The patient now sees his wife on every corpse of those he's murdered, and not only that, he hears her laughter, and for a moment to him, it's like she's alive with him, and like I said, there's really no other way to say it. He becomes overtaken with passion in these moments, and that's all I'm going to say about that. And that passion makes the line, my heart breaks every time I dismember the flesh, that much more darker, because he's not broken over the fact that he's taken someone's life, but rather that yet again his wife is taken from him, forcing him to restart this cycle of deception, murder, delusion, passion, and depression. This chapter concludes with the repetition of the chorus, intercut with the audience singing their own haunting lines. With your last breath, only through death, our voices will join together. Symbolizing that with every death, a new voice joins the audience, adding their voice to the song that has consumed the patient's mind and overpowering it more and more as they become louder and stronger. The other side of these lines are that the patient realizing that it's only in death of others that he can truly join together with his wife once more. almost as if every single one of these people are empty vessels for his wife to inhabit for a short time. The song shows us how devoted the patient is to recreating the song he's heard mentally into the physical world. He really meant that he wants the world to sing it, almost like a virus to him that needs to be spread and grown. That this song is the embodiment of the love that he felt for his wife, and from this point forward in the album, there's no more talk of loneliness or emptiness. That this vacancy behind his eyes has now become filled with this song. That this patient fully commits to the idea that his purpose and compulsion from this point forward is to bring the song to the entire world. It was a love that was once so big and so pure, noticeable to even the doctor who never saw he and his wife interact at all, that now has contorted into this amalgam of deception, murder, and shared suffering and delusion. All throughout the track, the patient understands the weight of what he is doing to recreate the song, and while being apologetic, it does not prevent him from harming others in order to bring the song and his wife into the world. And it is haunting and sad altogether. And it is so horrifying what he's doing, but at the same time, on some level, to just feel some sense of connection to that love, to that purpose, to that hope that he had before, you can kind of understand. And although you don't condone what he's done, you begin to sympathize with it. The next track, Disintegrating, starts with two lines. Abandon all hope, ye who enter here. This halfway house is home to a madman. Abandon all hope being the inscription over the gates of hell from the Inferno section of the Divine Comedy by Dante, which essentially means that there is no escape, there is no hope, and only despair past these gates, meaning that once someone crosses the threshold of this home, of the patient's home, there is no escape, there is no mercy. Your fate is sealed. We finally get some semblance of time with this track. Like, that's been something that's actually been missing throughout the album, but we kind of get an idea of a timeline here, that his hell house has been filled with ghosts for a year, essentially. He's been living this song in now what seems meaningless days, finally realizing that all this murder, all this drug abuse, all this deception and lies end with the same conclusion, that he and his wife are still separated forever. That even though, as he says, he's sensed her here because he gets that glimpse of her in every person he's murdered, it still doesn't bring her back to him completely. It's in the chorus that we see this growing realization in the patient's mind now. For what it's worth, it's worsening, and my song demands an ending. Closure karma can't control the beast I've born to swallow us whole. And yes, my heart may beat again, but we all need medicine. So forgive me, love, I'm choosing a fitting end to the abusing. The chorus of the song shows us that nothing will bring her back, and the closure he's seeking in this song that he's been so obsessed with doesn't actually exist. That the beast he's born, i.e. this guilt and delusion he's so given into, has fully consumed him beyond redemption. He's having this moment of clarity where he sees that the song isn't completed in the bodies he piles up and hides, or medication abuse, the things he's used to see her in these brief moments, but rather in his own end. Instead of being seen as a messenger or a trigger or this tool in this song where what's being delivered he's not in control of, he is now taking this sense of ownership to his actions, that this true healing he's been searching for in closure isn't in composing the song, but rather in forgiving himself. In the next verse, he has what seems to be a dream where he's, instead of him falling formless and shapeless and helpless to a stream like in the second track, Dreaming, he's having a final discussion with his wife and is given this forgiveness he so longs for from her. This, to me, furthers this idea that his wife was never malicious, but rather a beacon of hope and love that was twisted by his grief, guilt, and delusion. Verse ends with his wife forgiving him, for everything that he's done, and the victims of this song sounding their applause, which to me is a callback to medicating and composing, as they are the only tracks you actually hear clapping on. You'll hear them when the patient says, "Doctor, I can't thank you enough," "Doctor, you won't forget this," in medicating, and during certain guitar parts in composing. Again, to me, symbolizing that the audience of the song of grief, despair, have always been a part of the journey, lingering in the background. We've always been a part of the journey, lingering in the background. I mean, we were clapping along at him being released, celebrating with him, and then in composing, we're also clapping along because we are a part of the song and inviting other people into this audience, inviting other people into this experience with the patient. Also, to me, kind of super delusional, because in my opinion, the victims of his song clapping along, like in an approving manner in any way, is like kind of weird, and also, not how that would work, because he was the one who murdered them, so, do with that whatever you want. And to kind of tag back to this idea of us clapping along with him during certain parts as the audience, in this specific case, clapping along to his resolution of his guilt is interesting because, as I've said before, we've been going along with him on his journey, and we know that in this moment, through all this pain, all this agony, all this self-torture he's put himself through and others through, he's finally coming to term and accepting his wife's forgiveness. And as horrific and sad as it is to say, it's worth celebrating. Given that we have these insights into his mind and struggles and what he's done, we feel the relief alongside him in this, even though we know that, again, it doesn't excuse the things that he's done. Before he wakes up from this dream with his wife, she tells him the doctor has to go. The doctor has to go was a line that bothered me for a while, because it almost seemed like the patient's wife was advocating for him to murder the doctor after that moment of closure between them. And it's an idea that doesn't pair well with the patient saying that it's always been the doctor's job to fix what's happened to him. But upon some further introspection and inspection about it, I really think that the implication here is a sense of urgency. So the doctor has to go generally would imply a sense of interrupting need. And in this case, I think it's a way for the patient to rationalize the only person who can actually help resolve this struggle or song is the doctor. That it's always been the doctor's job to fix this emptiness or pain inside of him, and it's always been the doctor who has been with him physically throughout this journey. This track ends with a repetition of the chorus, and then we are thrust into the next track, Healing. Healing puts us in a conversation between the patient and what I can assume is his wife, but we only hear his side of the conversation, which all the more solidifies that he's fully consumed into this delusion. The first verse goes, "Baby, maybe you've got something. I think maybe we're onto something big, bigger than I could have ever imagined." This has the patient affirming his resolve of following the thread of closure he's now experienced from speaking to his wife in the dream in the previous track. Not only that, understanding his place in all of this when it comes to creating the song and presenting it to the world. The song calls back to dreaming with the constant repetition of "tonight it's worse, tonight the screaming hurts." This repetition feels like he's now no longer avoiding the memory of what happened that night. Now that he's received the closure, he can almost embrace what he's done and finally accept it. Patient now seeing the end as it draws near, he begins to collect some things, though we're not specifically told what they are, but we can assume that he may be in a manic state, rummaging through his entire household, and in the midst of this episode he calls the doctor, knowing that he's the only one who'll be able to receive the song that he's been composing this entire time. The song finishes with the doctor because he is the one the patient was meant to be the messenger for. The doctor has been there with the patient almost from the beginning, and now the patient realizes that he is the one who needs to be there at the end. We get what I would consider the chorus of the song with these words: "Music this magnificent and medicine are one and the same. They make life worth living, hearts worth healing." The patient realizes that this is his swan song. Swan song, if you don't know, is a phrase or gesture that represents someone or something's final performance or act. I think it's an ancient belief that swans sing a beautiful song right before they die. And to the patient, this song is so beautiful to him that not only does it give him this like high and healing he's experienced from medication and abuse, that it's the reason for his whole existence. The reason why he didn't die in the factory was because the song needed to be expressed to the entire world. The idea of him being the messenger to the song we see in the next verse as he tells the doctor to come and get the ending of his song and thanks him for everything that he's done and that he's finally healing, which I am sure was a double-edged sword for the doctor. One, he was probably excited to hear that the patient was finally healing, finally being able to move forward, but also probably really terrifying because I'm pretty sure the patient called him in this episode and was probably talking really fast and telling him to get a good song, and he's probably like, what's happening right now? The next two verses show us the mania the patient is experiencing as he is like manically searching through his house, collecting his things, believing this song is finally coming to completion, almost like preparing for it. The patient knows that as soon as the doctor arrives, the song will be finished and he will be relieved of all responsibility of it. So like he's dashing through the house, getting everything like ready, so to speak. It's almost like when your mom was having company over and at the last minute, she's like rushing through the house to get everything clean and put away. And it's like, we can't let them know that we said everything has to be clean. The doctor arrives, begins to turn the doorknob. The patient hears this, and we hear the haunting repetition, tonight it's worse, tonight the screaming hurts, before the final chorus ends on a sinister sounding note that carries us seamlessly into the final song, dying. Dying is the final chapter, like, obviously, I guess. I don't know if that's obvious. I mean, if you've never heard the album, it's okay, I'm getting sidetracked. I love this track because of its instrumentation, storytelling, and resolution to the patient's journey, while also calling into question the entire journey we've been on, but we'll get to that in a bit. The first verse plunges us into the patient's voice while he is on the floor of the residence, collapsed and delirious. He sings to us in haunting tone. Picture yourself in a nightmarish scene of such grotesque complexity that you'd kill to be dreaming. Your body's been dying while your mind has been trying to make yourself picture a life where you'd kill for your lover and a song in your head. The deaths of countless others. Simply set up the lyrics for your symphony. That's where you'll find me. He's speaking or really telling us, the audience, to put ourselves in his shoes, even though unknowingly to him, we've been alongside him this entire time, privy to his thoughts and motivations. We're not only told to picture this nightmarish scene of dying alone, but to picture a life where you'd kill for others, for your lover, in order to create the lyrics to a symphony, which, again, we don't have to picture because we lived it alongside him, and some of us in the audience are the people he murdered in order to do that. So for the patient, this feels like his very final onus of the story being told, using his last moments to create this final picture of him lying, dying, mirroring the scene where he discovered his own wife's body. It's interesting to me that we're now being invited into this moment with him, not to empathize, but to understand what's happening to him before the doctor finally enters his home. And boy, does the doctor enter his home to like a lot. Like I just imagine like the picture of Troy walking into the apartment where everything's happening, stuff's on fire, and people are like panicking, just holding the pizza. Like that's exactly how I imagine the doctor walking into this apartment. After a lengthy instrumentation where you're stuck with all this cacophony of sound, this chaos, this intense musical instrumentation of the patient laying there, again hearkening to this like soundstage created of violence and confusion and chaos, it slows down, and we are then switched to the doctor's perspective, having entered the home of the patient after receiving the phone call from the previous track. And I'm going to break it into two sections, his monologue, because it's a lot to take in. So he starts, the doctor. Something awful has happened here. This is so much worse than I ever could have imagined. I knew it all along that this man should not have been released. God, what's happened here? He's completely torn his apartment apart. The smell is overpowering, a foul, pungent odor, like rotten food, or I don't know, possibly something worse. But there's something else that's almost overpowering. I think it's a woman's perfume. Oh no. The doctor walks in and is like immediately aware that something is wrong. Like there's no doubt in his mind. And it is in the first two lines of his monologue that he parallels two things the patient has said previously. The first being the use of the word awful, where the patient used this word in relation to the hidden knowledge of hiding his addiction and not actually getting better and recovering, or like the things that he's going to do in order to write this song that he's plagued by. The doctor uses it in the realization of how terrible things have gotten with the patient. The second parallel would be the use of the phrase, "than I could have ever imagined." The patient uses this phrase in a previous track as a way to convey his belief and wonderment that he's become a part of something beyond himself. The song he's managed to manifest into reality now has an ethereal life of its own, and not only that, its end has and will always be with the doctor. Doctor, on the other hand, uses this phrase in Disbelief and Horror, understandably so. He's having this visceral response to what he's walked into because it's beyond literally anything he himself could have imagined. Like if he imagined something, it's worse than that. This man who's been in his care for at least a year, probably way more than that, has called him in what he can assume in some manic episode, like frantically talking about this song that he has to deliver to him, this song that ends with the doctor, and he's thanking him, and he's walking into seeing him grotesquely laid out on the floor. The doctor then laments about releasing the patient. It's a hesitation and potential regret that has always lingered within the doctor whenever dealing with the patient, and one that has been foreshadowed all the way back in the first track, introducing where he says, "Well, he's been released again today, and I'm back where I started, looking over old notes, listening to tapes, wondering how bad I potentially messed up this time. And I know he seems fine, but seems can be a very dangerous word, especially in this business. It can be fatal." That's this in medias res storytelling mechanic in action. We're told from the very beginning that the patient is handless, mentally and emotionally troubled, and unknowingly murdered his wife during a night terror episode. And honestly, the start of this album feels super out of place in not how I would have started an album, or how I've heard any concept album started before. You have a character, the doctor, who never at once sings in this album, this musically constructed album, who only speaks vocally and is lightly peppered throughout the story versus being a main driver and as the first person to say anything, any words on this album. But doing it this way shows us that the doctor is genuine in his care for the patient, and it makes it this moment that much more devastating and empathetic for him. It makes him more relatable because the beginning and ending monologues give your imagination space to grow and fill in a lot of gaps of his involvement. This sense of responsibility and care for the patient only furthered by the fact that the doctor personally showed up. We get more parallels with the things that the doctor has said to previous tracks when he says things like he's completely torn his apartment apart. This not only is a direct consequence of the patient looking for whatever he was looking for in his manic episode prior to the doctor's arrival, but a callback to Waking, where he was ripping through his room like a madman after seeing the horrific thing he's done. The doctor then comments on a foul, pungent, rotten-smelling odor that is mixed with another scent, saying that there's something else that's almost overpowering. I think it's a woman's perfume. Again, a reference to Waking, where the patient has christened the walls with his wife's perfume. We go from the figurative meaning of the smell of her perfume struggles to cover everything said at the beginning of sentencing, which meant the smell was a part of what covered the memories of that night for the patient, to the literal perfume struggling to cover the rotten smell permeating throughout this entire apartment. What follows next is the doctor's even more haunting discovery. I found the patient. He's lying on the floor in the center of the living room, completely naked, emaciated, deathly pale. It appears he hasn't eaten anything at all for weeks. The infection has spread up his arms and must have reached his brain. There's bulging bright red veins all the way up from his wrist to his neck. There's empty bottles everywhere of alcohol and medication. My God, the smell is sickening. There's blood coming out of his mouth, nose, ears. He's not dead yet, but he's close. Well, that puts that whole nice, like nightmarish scene of grotesque complexity in perspective. The doctor discovers the patient lying naked, bleeding out, delirious, septic, and dying on the living room floor of his apartment with blood escaping his mouth, his ears, his nose, finally succumbing to his abuse of medication, alcohol, and the improper care of his amputations. Although not overtly confirmed, the bright red veins creeping up his arms are almost certainly due to a blood infection of his arm, while the bleeding from his eyes, nose, and mouth point to him poisoning himself with strychnine and paint thinner. The smell, of course, could be attributed to the combination of hidden decomposing bodies in the patient's apartment, his wife's perfume, or the patient himself. The patient is now steadily on his way to become a recipient of the very message he delivered to his own victims: death. And after seeing the patient and kneeling down to him, the doctor concludes his monologue with his final lines in the album: "I failed. This is my fault." And somehow, he's smiling at me. I think he's whispering something. No, not just whispering. I think he's singing. We see, again, this feeling of personal responsibility for the patient's recovery and the care, and the doctor laments his failure to save his life. But that thought is fleeting because the doctor is seemingly confounded by the smile of this suffering man on the floor. And not only that, the patient is whispering to him. No, as the doctor says, not just whispering, singing. And for me, the first time I listened to this song, I was so enamored and wrapped up in the doctor and what he was saying, and the instrumentation and the hushed tones and the story being told and how it was being presented, that I missed the fact that at some point while the doctor is monologuing, the patient begins to actually sing to him very lightly, and you can hear it building. It's so well done that now we have the patient who is delivering these last words, these last lyrics that will finally complete the song to the doctor. Those words being, "Now place your ear to my lips. Trace these notes with your fingertips. They dance alone on my last breath. This is the end. This is death." However, the verses that the patient gives the doctor is only half the song, though. Remember when in composing I quoted what the audience was singing in the background? Well, if you take those words and combine them with these, it becomes this: "With your last breath, only through death, our voices will join together. Now place your ear to my lips, trace these notes with your fingertips. They dance alone on my last breath. This is the end. This is death." These lyrics are a morose culmination of the patient's horrific acts and agony. In the first few listens of composing, it's easy to interpret that the subject of those lyrics are the audience, aka the victims of the patient, explaining what it is happening to his current victim. However, it is my belief that this is in fact the audience singing to the patient that his death is what truly will join he and his wife's voice together once again, which to me makes the notes that the patient mentions in his final words to the doctor mean the patient's own voice. Much like how the patient's mind made the screams of his wife that night this song that he could never escape and thus could only recreate when murdering other people. Follows next is a fantastic instrumentation, and it allows us to soak it in and create the scene of the doctor and the patient together alone in this room one last time. This being a beautiful representation of their therapy sessions and journey that they've shared to this point, where the doctor was hopeful and the patient grief-stricken, lamenting his loss. We now find the roles reversed, where the patient is hopeful to be rejoined with his wife in death, and the doctor grief-stricken and lamenting his inability to heal the patient and help him. This instrumentation builds and builds until it cuts, and we are given familiar phrases being sung and layered on top of one another. Those being, "The lines I wear on my wrists are there to prove that I exist. Someone call an ambulance because something's not right. The smell of her perfume struggles to cover everything." and we were inseparable. These lyrics are now taking on a new meaning as they are repeated over and over again. The lines I wear around my wrist are there to prove I exist, representing this physical grounding to reality. And incoming blue curtain moment here, the patient can look down to his handless wrist and see these infections, and knowing that his death proves that he was indeed alive. But also a figurative representation of how this song and grief had infected and consumed him, eventually aiding in his death. Someone call an ambulance can now be interpreted as the doctor calling for the ambulance in response to what he's walked into, the smell of her perfume, again meaning the smell struggling to cover the pungent odor of everything going on in the apartment and everything going on with his memories. And then we are inseparable, which is a feeling that the patient has struggled with his entire journey, has been not being able to be with his wife, where they were once, we saw in dreaming, where it changed from making love to his wife, making them inseparable, to that bond being tainted with betrayal and blood, making this feeling of grief inseparable to him when he thought about her. Then to him becoming inseparable to his song that consumed him, which was her voice, and then to realizing that he will always be separated from his wife due to his lack of being forgiven. And then finally, we hear the last line repeated until it fades into a soft acoustic guitar, giving the impression that now, with its new meaning, in his death, he and his wife are truly inseparable. And for a moment, one last moment, suspended in time, those words hang in the air. And with this horrific prophecy being fulfilled, the lyrics finished, the song delivered to the doctor, the patient's journey ends. And we are now inseparable from this song that he laboriously crafted. And I could understandably end the video and explanation here, but I have some ideas that I think are worth exploring. There are, in my humble opinion, two ways to actually interpret this album. The first being everything that happened exactly as it had said. Patient murders his wife in a night terror episode, slowly but surely descends into madness and addiction, believes he hears his wife, and he must create the song by using the death of others to compose it. Further, he descends into madness and then culminates in his death due to addiction, abuse, and infection, which I think is perfectly fine. I think that's a good way to interpret an album. I think it's written out really well. I think it's a good contained story, and I think it's a complete and succinct tragedy. Second one, not being confirmed in any way whatsoever. Like it's literally a blue curtain moment, but I think to me, it's like valid and has some merit to it, and I think it's worth exploring. So if you're willing to indulge in more of my madness, allow me to paint your curtains blue. That interpretation being that everything after recovering took place only in his mind as he lay dying on the floor of his apartment from the combination of succumbing to the spreading infection of his wounds and poisoning himself with strychnine and paint thinner. Where do I get this idea from, you may ask? Well, I'm so glad you asked. You're very smart for asking that question. It's from the beginning of Dying, where the patient says, "Your body's been dying while your mind's been trying to make you picture a life where you'd kill for your lover, and a song in your head, the deaths of countless others. Simply set up the lyrics for your symphony. That's where you'll find me." Okay, I get it. You might be thinking that it's along what I said earlier, where the patient was trying to get us in the place where we would be able to, understand why he did what he did. He's trying to get us to understand, his motives and reasoning. But when you take this verse in the context of the entire album, it starts to make a little more sense. In the tape recordings of Introducing, we hear the patient explain to the doctor how the infection, or as he calls them, the lines around his wrist, are getting better, which shows how the patient views the infection as a means of proving his body is real. What he's physically experiencing is real. This isn't some nightmare in waking, nor addiction-fueled delusion. He can see it. He can feel it. This infection that is slowly moving through his body and consuming him is a representation of his grief and guilt. Upon his release after his self-surgery, we see that he's covertly hiding this addiction and mental degradation under supervision, meaning that the doctor coming to his home may not have been because the patient called him in a manic episode, but rather was a part of his routine care or even a wellness check because they haven't heard from him in so long. This also puts in perspective some of the questions I had while listening, particularly to composing, all of them revolving around his victims. Like, I can imagine it's beyond difficult managing life without hands, but to be able to lure, murder, dismember, and hide the bodies is a lot to suspend disbelief for without appendages. I'm not saying that it can't be done. I'm not also challenging someone to prove it can be done, but it is a feat to accomplish when you think about it. Not only that, but to be able to accomplish all of these things unnoticed while under supervision as well would be difficult for the most competent of perpetrator. So I believe that shortly after recovering and partly into composing, the patient decided to finish what he started and to take his own life. And the journey that we have been on from composing on has been him retelling everything that has happened as he lays dying on the floor of his apartment. This to me also helps with the construction of the audience and how he needed to kill people to construct the song, because it helped him distance himself from the horror of his own actions, which would call into one other thing. Was the doctor even real, or just a construction of the patient's delusions based on him being taken care of, checked in upon, and all of that stuff? How would the patient have access to the doctor's session tapes and thoughts that we hear? This can also reframe the doctor's motivations for fixing and taking responsibility for the patient's healing, as the patient himself projecting his own desire of those feelings onto the doctor. He's projecting this desire to be healed, projecting this desire to be fixed, and realizing that he can't give himself that forgiveness is trying to manifest this person who can potentially do that for him. Most of this story is told from the patient's perspective, or what I'm going to call like patient third person adjacent, where the patient is still telling the story, but as if he's not a part of it. I'm sure there's like some like super technical term for like that perspective, but like we see time and time again this distancing language and inability to really accept what he's done until, at least from his perspective, his final moments. I feel this viewpoint would best fit the tragedy of this character. Like, he's broken on so many levels, alone, lost, hurting, and wanting to make sense of this random mistake of violence that he's committed against someone that he so deeply loved. And the only way it seems that he can do it is dying in his dying hours, constructing this journey of twisted redemption and forgiveness. It makes me almost sympathize with him more. It also, to me, better exemplifies the purity of which he loved his wife, and the purity of which he believed his wife loved him. That even after doing the most wretched and awful things he could imagine, he believes that she would have forgiven him. And I don't know. Maybe I'm just looking too much into things or creating conspiracy theories out of nothing, but to me, that just makes a lot of sense. It would paint this tragedy way more emotionally impacting, that the only way that this person could even cope with what he has done is to create this scenario where he finds forgiveness through the most twisted way in this delusional moment of his life as he's laying dying alone on the floor. I don't know. Maybe I'm just creating something out of nothing. Maybe all of this is just like a blue curtain moment. But you know what? I haven't seen anybody else talk about this album, so... And with all that being said, all of that being said, there's something to me about storytelling that pulls us into where we're okay with believing in a well-constructed, compelling, somewhat innocent, and fleshed-out lie. Because in all actuality, that's what storytelling is in concept. Entertaining lies that give us enough believability to become attached to, and even if for a moment, forget who we are. When done well, stories keep us coming back for more rereads, rewatches, or in my case, and hopefully yours and what we've talked about, re-listens. Well, that'll do it for me with this video. If you made it all the way through, like, honestly, I just want to say thank you. I appreciate you more than you'll ever know, because I really took a long time to write this because I wanted to make sure I got it right and presented information in a way that made sense. Hopefully it made sense. And I really love this album, and I just really want to thank you for being a part of listening to someone talk about a concept album from almost 20 years ago because he loves it so much.